to clean us out every day. Daily Solutions. Who is here to wipe our worries away? Daily Solutions. It's the Daily Solutions podcast.
Welcome back, everybody.
Yeah, my name is Ashkan.
And I'm Graham.
All right.
And today's question for you is, well, I guess for us, but to you, is
From you.
any tips on how to structure your menu? You can't tell it, but I'm doing little air quotes right now.
Yeah,
menu
I can tell you. I'm verifying that he is doing them.
of float options. Any tips on how to structure your menu of float options?
Yeah, I do. I got some tips.
What are they?
Well, I guess the first one is a warning, because I think what can happen is you have floats, right?
Yeah.
And perhaps you offer different lengths of float, maybe a 60 and a 90 minute.
Yeah, maybe.
And maybe you also have some memberships.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say perhaps you have another service like massage or something, but you also want to offer some sort of discount if people want a float and a massage. And also different memberships if people want like floats and massage versus just floats or just massages.
Mm-hmm.
And for those frequency and those lengths, and basically with just a few things, like all you have is a float tank and a massage therapist, but all the different combinations of that result in this menu of prices that's huge, right? You all of a sudden have a list of 30 things on your website of, well, if you want like 2 floats and 1 massage, it's this price.
It's factorials if you want to know how to actually do the math on the combinations there, too.
And it just gets out of hand, basically. And that's not just out of hand in terms of like, your opinion. There's just people have done research to show that there's choice paralysis, right? If someone's presented with 30 different options, they freeze up and they don't want to choose any of them. And so there's actually a benefit to you to focus on keeping this as simple as you can and on reducing the number of choices and on making this so that it's not an overwhelming experience for someone when they want to go look at your pricing.
And that magic number kind of range is in the realm of 3 to 4 options. And so if you're setting out your memberships, for example, or if you're setting out your basic kinds of floats, it doesn't mean that you only need 3 options total, right? Like if you have massage and acupuncture and floating of 2 different lengths and you offer some other service, that all of a sudden you've like broken that rule, right?
Uh-huh.
It's just like keep things within those categories really simple. And honestly, if you can get down to one option from the pure pricing theory kind of standpoint or option theory, that's actually kind of better in a lot of ways.
And I feel like graphic design can play a big role in this too. Like if you can do a really good job communicating information clearly, it frees you up to have a few more options because it's easy enough to read what's on the page and see what's going on that it doesn't feel overwhelming. So it's almost like the number itself is kind of one part of it, and how well you displayed and communicated and how clear it is kind of another factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And even along those same lines too, you can have a bigger menu that you don't let people immediately in on, kind of having a secret menu or a hidden menu to your things, right? So, for example, we offer 2, 4, and 8 float-a-month memberships, and we also do a big yearly membership package as well, which we can kind of get into why we launched that.
Yeah.
That's an interesting menu of items story. But we also offer, and this isn't on our website or in our shop anywhere, but we also offer 12 floats a month and 16 floats a month for memberships. It's just that those are so seldom purchased, and the people who do purchase them are usually upgrading from 8 floats a month and, are kind of like, hey, I want to get in more often. Do you have a cheaper membership or something like that? And we're like, yeah, we totally do. And that lets us keep our displayed menu really simple while still having the benefit of if someone does want to get a 12 float a month package or a 16 float a month package, it's totally available, and we can even mention it to them in person. It's just not cluttering up our listed menu.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting topic, this whole menu price thing, because there's actually like a shocking amount of research that's gone into this question. Like if you want to look into kind of more hardcore like neuromarketing as they call it, like a lot of it's focused on this phenomena of like how many options and what the prices should be and stuff like that and what kind of behavior that leads to. And there's like a lot of weird stuff and interesting tactics out there that companies use. There's like dummy pricing that people will have where like you'll actually have you'll go from 2 choices of price for things to 3, and you never really expect people to buy that third one, but it's just there to make like the other 2 look really good. is like an interesting tactic that works. You know, they test this stuff and it actually works. Is the crazy part of all of it.
Yep. So an example might be that you have, 2 floats for $100 a month or something, or they can do 4 floats for $180, or they can do 8 floats for $200. Right? And all of a sudden that 8 floats is so close to the 4 floats, and it's such a disproportionate jump. Like if you go from 2 to 4, you're going up $80. If you go from 4 to 8, you're going up $20.
Right.
And so you wouldn't actually expect anyone to buy the 4 float a month package. It's just there as kind of this decoy to make that 8 float a month look really good in comparison. And by extension, even that 2 floats down at the bottom is almost serving the main purpose of making that 8 floats at $200 look even better.
And there's some of this that comes in kind of subtler ways too. And when we first started, we started just with a 4 float a month membership. Was kind of the first thing we offered. We started with no memberships, and then when we first we first introduced a 4 float a month membership, and what was interesting is when we expanded to adding 2 floats a month and 8 floats a month on top of that, I started to get a lot of questions from people when they saw the 8 float a month membership of like, oh, is it okay to float that much? Like that was a question that I got. And it was like, we didn't even have a ton of people necessarily signing up for our 8 float a month memberships, but it spawned a conversation in people and it got people to realize that, this is not maybe something that you do once every 6 months to pamper yourself. This is something that people can do to become like an actual part of their routine and part of their lives and make these kind of incremental improvements. And so when people would say that, like, are you supposed to float that much? Or is it okay to float that much? And you being like, yeah, I mean, floating that much is great. Like, the effects last for 3-4 days afterwards. So when you float twice a week, you're just kind of like living in float land. Like people be like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, let me do the 4 float a month membership. And like, it was almost like getting the brain to kind of consider it in a different way.
For sure. So I guess so far what we've covered is make sure that your options are simple.
Yeah.
Know that people are comparing options not just by themselves, but in comparison to the other options out there as well. So you can kind of have inner menu dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the last thing you just said?
That these, I guess I don't know, it's the less concrete point, but they can even spur not necessarily like price relationship questions, but even just like points of conversation.
Right. Even realizing that floating can be done that often is
changes in perspective, I guess.
So another really big one is this idea of price anchoring.
Yeah.
Too. And as far as like that whole, like we were talking about, the psychology of pricing, which definitely feel free to Google that. There's some great neuromarketing books out there as well. But the idea of price anchoring is just, of anchoring in general too, is one of the most well-studied and kind of most salient things that you'll run into out there. And it's this idea that human beings are creatures of association. And because we exist on a timeline that just keeps pushing forward, anything that comes before something else happens, we still draw our conclusions about the second thing from the first thing. So when we're doing pricing, what that means is you want to show the high prices first and anchor high is kind of the saying in the pricing world. And the reason for that is because if you get them thinking about that high number first, then everything else is going to seem smaller by comparison. And so when I said that we had this good story about why we did a yearly membership to begin with, this is actually the main reason was we had this, 8 float a month membership that was several $100s, and we wanted to make that 8 float a month membership look better. So we were like, okay, well, what's a big price that we can put that's way higher than that few $100s a month? And we decided to do a yearly membership where people pay upfront for a float a week, so 52 floats. At our center, we launched that with it cost over $1,500. It's about $1,560, I think, was the amount. And now all of a sudden on our website, on our wall where we have the other membership pricing, we have this big $1,560, which they see first. And it's actually, the sign is even bigger than the other ones to even take up physically more weight. And then it goes down to our 8 float a month. And then it goes down to 4 floats a month. And by the time you get down to $65 for a 90-minute float, like that looks incredibly reasonable compared to $1,560. As opposed to if you start at $65 and work up from there, by the time you hit 8 floats and it's several $100s, that already looks unreasonable. And then you get up to $1,560 and you're like, okay, well, that's really high compared to that $65 I started with. So again, just the order that you list things in can really matter. And the standard advice is always list from highest price down to lowest price.
And this sounds like really silly in a certain way. You're like, come on, like people aren't that gullible. And you see,
totally
I mean,
are.
this is like the infomercial trick, right? They're like, where they cross out the number and they drop it by $10, and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah. But like it's been studied almost more than anything, like in this kind of psychology of marketing field, and it's just consistently true. And it's actually not even it doesn't even matter if the number is a price. I mean, people can get anchored by, they did a study with like giving people waiting tickets with numbers on them, and ran it with like one group getting lower numbers on their waiting ticket, like 8 and 9 and 10, another group getting much higher numbers in the like hundreds. And just getting a higher number on your ticket that said where you were in line to get service led to people spending more money. Like it's crazy how much you are actually totally susceptible to these things, even if you think you're not.
Even things like on an intake form, having someone write down their phone number before saying whether they think a price is high or not, versus not writing down their phone number. The people who write down the phone number, it's such a long string of high numbers that they'll say a price seems lower than the people who didn't write down the phone number.
Yeah, it's crazy. You have no control over your life is basically what you learn from all this stuff.
So price anchoring, though, is a really important one. If you're going to list your prices and you have to list them in some order, do it from high to low.
And you want to talk about round numbers too?
Yeah, that's one that kind of goes back and forth a lot, which is an interesting one. So this is things like, do you want to sell a float for $69.99 versus $70 or something like that, right? Or $99 versus $100
right.
or anything like that. And it might just be a weak enough effect, which is why people's opinion keeps kind of hopping back and forth, or it might just be so dependent upon other factors. But you'll read all kinds of, like, this is actually probably one of the most debated points. But one thing that does seem to be the case is that round numbers, like to the zeros and stuff like that. So, for instance, $100 going from two digits to 3 digits and having it be that round 100 number just seems to occupy a more important high-priced place in our brain. So even pricing something at $102, for example, as opposed to $100, they've done studies where that sells better. So pricing at 98 or 102 tends to be better than pricing directly at 100. Which is interesting. And then there's others that show absolutely no difference when they've done the studies between like $99.99 and pricing at $100. And it's, again, a lot of that's a little bit all over the place. At Float On, we kind of have our own philosophical ideas behind that one too, which is we like to be a transparent organization. And so keeping our prices kind of really simple is very in line with our brand in that sense. So
there's also no sales tax here in Oregon. So for us, like, there is actually like an actual tangible simplicity to something costing a round number, like, because people don't end up with change or anything like that.
Yeah, so that's kind of our decision there. So we would happily price things at more like $65 or $75. But oftentimes, even if you look at our Float Tank Solutions site or things like that, lots of our pricing doesn't end exactly on 1,000 or exactly on 100. It'll end at 70 or something like that, or at 40. And random fun fact, 7 and 4 are the values that are the highest compared to what we psychologically view them as. So like in our brain, both 4 and 7 are lower than what they are in comparison.
And this is, there's a bunch of stuff like this out there, and it's probably not worth completely obsessing about. Like, you don't need to go and try to optimize for every single one of these kind of psychological studies that you hear. But they're good rules of thumbs to follow and things to kind of know about in the background. But at the end of the day, I mean, some of the stuff we said at the beginning of this, I think is going to outweigh a lot of these more subtler effects. Like if you have a giant menu of stuff and it doesn't look good and it's not designed well graphically and it's not clear and you know what I mean, these things are going to be roadblocks before people even start having these more kind of subtle psychological effects. So definitely focus on the basics, and that's gonna take you the furthest.
Yep. Keep it simple, anchor high. I think those are like the two really big ones.
Yeah. And then profit,
Profit. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. And we will see you tomorrow. If you have questions of your own, go to floatanksolutions.com/podcast and send them our way.